Hey there, BuckTube. Welcome back to another episode of Buck's Books. As you can see, I'm still off-roading with these incredibly slow and lazy dogs. And they're all watered, they rested. But they are insistent that we will turn this downhill mile into a downhill hour in the shade, which frees up my time to walk so slowly it's almost in place and do another Buck's Books for you. And this one is called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion by Jonathan Haidt. So, I think we should probably start with his rallying cry throughout the book, which is that the human animal is 90% chimp and 10% bee. And I love that. This book, it is very much to my taste. It's my bread and butter. It is an evolutionary biology attempt to explain the psychology of morality. Right? So absolutely doomed effort. Haidt is deeply liberal and a career academic who, despite being trained as a psychologist, is attempting to study morality. Best of luck with that. And he's an experimental psychologist, so he does a whole bunch of that, does a whole bunch of research. And he's established that, as far as he's concerned, morality is sort of an after effect thing. Like, it shows up after the decision has already been made via gut feelings, and the justifications emerge post hoc, right? So the analogy he keeps making is it's like the riding an elephant, right? I think we could also do like a barnacle on a whale, but nobody asked me. It's like riding an elephant, in that the elephant rider can't do a lot to control the elephant. Right? It's not like you're going to correct the elephant. But for you to remain on top of the elephant, you kind of have to go along with what the elephant is doing and make the best of it as the situation progresses. And that is how rationality serves our passions, in the words of Hume. He says that logic and rationality is nothing but a slave to the passions. So this is, we make up our minds ahead of time and then we justify them after the fact. So the example that I typically give is the one talking about the incestuous brother and sister, right? So it's a thought experiment. There's this brother and sister, and they're in love. They weren't raised together. They meet later in life and they just head over heels it. They move to a place where nobody knows them whatsoever, and they have both been sterilized, right? They're not capable of reproducing, and they want to live together as husband and wife, right? Is this immoral? And overwhelmingly, people say yes. And then the experimenter says, well, how come? And overwhelmingly, the people are not able to furnish a rational justification, because they'll say things like, well, what if their offspring is deformed? Experimenters like, well, there is no offspring because they've both been chemically sterilized, and also they're not interested in children. Well, what if they bring shame to the family? There is no family. The rest of the family is dead, and they live somewhere where no one knows them. Nobody even knows they were related. So is it still immoral? And generally speaking, everybody says yeah, but nobody could justify the why, right? So that's about as far as it goes when you're trying to... Come on, pups. That's about as far as it goes when you're trying to study morality from a psychological perspective. It's very limited. So this is an illustration of how we make up our minds about these things after the fact. Our gut instinct is what has actually made up our mind. And then in retrospect, we apply that Ben Shapiro veneer of facts and logic as though we are this perfect rational creature and we could never be swayed by something so petty and instinctual as these knee-jerk reactions, because we're too civilized, we're too evolved. But it's always just PR after the fact, That's what we do. And that's what really got me digging my teeth into this book. I had really liked that he led with the Hume quote, because that justified pretty much my entire perspective. Now, if people tell you that they change their mind based on more information, that's probably not the case. Yeah, maybe, like 5% of people might do that if they're forced to, like if there are external factors that are also compelling them to change their mind. But generally speaking, they're going to go with what makes them feel good to begin with, and they're going to make up reasons as to why they did it after the fact. And those reasons can come across several different domains, many of which are explored later on in the book when he talks about the differences between liberals and conservatives, which, that was a hoot. 90% chimp, 10% bee. What could that possibly mean? Well, the 90% chimp is pretty self-explanatory, in that we are gross, feral, hairy, upright primates who tend towards violence. But the difference between the human animal and the chimpanzee animal is that the human animal is ultra-social, social like a rodent, social like an insect. Maybe not quite social like an insect unless you live in a fascist country. But for the most part, we are far more social than other primates because we can actually cooperate like wolves do. That doesn't happen in chimpanzees. You hear about chimpanzees hunting monkeys together, but they're not really hunting monkeys together. They're all just hunting monkeys in the same place. They're instinctively reacting to what seems like the best idea for them at the moment, right? It's not a pack mentality or a troop mentality is what it would be with chimps, I suppose. Because they're not capable of that kind of reasoning. In fact, as far as we know, the only primates that are us. So that's where the 10% B comes in. The superorganism, the group selection. Where human beings, typically males, are willing to sacrifice their lives for the quote-unquote greater good of whatever their in-group is, of their family, of their country, of their whatever. That's largely what the males are for. That's also something. You're not going to see these acts of messianic heroism showing up in baboons, in baboon colonies. That's just not how she works. That's specific to humans. And so our man Haidt is going back and forth over the course of the book, trying to justify why that would have developed in humans, and dunking on Dawkins and his selfish gene, and drawing all of these comparisons between actual ultra-social animals like meerkats and these army insects like wasps and ants, and how they too are willing to give their lives for the good of the hive. And sometimes we humans are willing to give our lives for the good of the hive, but you're never going to find a Cachupin monkey who's going to give his life for the good of the hive. It's just not in the programming. So that's one of the things that makes us different, makes us special, and we're not 100% sure why it developed unless we throw out prevailing evolutionary theory, which states that group selection was done away with in the 70s. They quote-unquote disproved it. But Haidt suggests, because if you can't explain group theory, you can't explain what's going on. Like, if you can't call in group theory, you can't explain what's going on here. You can't explain why human beings would do this. Why human beings would be so big on sacrifice that they'd build pretty much every major religion about it. And then he talks about religion, and that was fun. Our man remained very secular in his analysis and discussed how all these religions, they served the purpose of facilitating greater in-group cohesion and cooperation. And that's outside of, the small local tribe, to the point where it became the nation state, which he talks about it as like a carrier. So we're programmed, right, on a very deep evolutionary level to defend home and hearth, to defend the hive or the hill. But we no longer have hives and hills in the same way. especially with the development of the nuclear family and urbanization, which compels us to stop the multi-generational living, stash our loved ones in retirement homes, and move across the country to make a new life of like 3 people with the declining birth rates, And that's our new tribe, which allows us to fall handily into seeking meaning and purpose in expensive toys. Not to come off as a Marxist or anything gross. Now, you see what I'm saying here? It's just an awful convenient arrangement for like the Illuminati, the Anunnakis, whoever you think is pulling the strings. I don't care what your conspiracy theory is, but there's obviously someone pulling the strings. And whoever it is, they're getting off they're making off like a bandit in this deal. Whereas the rest of us are becoming increasingly ostracized and miserable. But we still have this compulsion, this bone deep need to defend home and hearth, to secure the tribe, the hive, the nest, the what have you. And that gets translated over, as it tends to, when you have creatures that are capable of symbolic thinking, into defending concepts. And these are the concepts we identify with. Like, I am a Westchester graduate, so I am more inclined to have fellowship with other Westchester graduates than I would some schmuck from community college or some hoity-toity, highfalutin turd from Harvard, that kind of thing. The in-group, out-group, the tribalism. Same thing with country, patriotism. I'm an American, proud to be, where at least I know I'm free. Sometimes Europeans show up and they want to talk, and that sucks, because America's number one, and you guys should immigrate, but don't immigrate because we're closing the borders. See, it's very convoluted. It's convoluted to be a patriot. It's convoluted to try to reconcile this tribalism, because this tribalism goes probably not back to our lizard brain, probably back to our midbrain, like horse brain, because the horses, they got the herds, and they probably care about herds, at least mildly. But I digress. Or our religions. A Christian is going to be more inclined to help a Christian than a non... Well, Christian's a bad example, because... You know what? No, it's not. We can stick with it. Because not all Christians follow Christ. So, one of those populist Christians, one of those Christians who go to church but don't actually understand the word, one of those middle American religious right Christians, they're probably not going to put in as much effort to help a non-Christian as they would a Christian, despite what the story of the Good Samaritan taught them in the book on the religion. Right? And that's tribalism. That's the way it goes. But each of these religions developed for the purpose of facilitating greater cohesion and functionality in the societies that evolved at that time. Now, I babble about this in other of my reviews. I don't remember which ones, but I've talked about how the Old Testament was specific for a moral system that would be beneficial for pastoralist herders who probably won't see more than 300 people in their entire life because they live in the desert, So eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth makes a lot of sense there, because you can keep track. And then when you get into New Testament territory, you have these sprawling megalopolises? I don't know how to pluralize that word because I don't know its etymology. But megalopolises. You have these big old cities, right? Like Rome, like Babylon, which had already fallen by now, with thousands and thousands and thousands, and coming up on in the neighborhood of 1 million people. So all of a sudden, you're not going to know everyone. You're going to walk down the street and see strangers. Strangers, that's unprecedented. Strangers never stayed strangers for long. The brain wasn't built for that. We can't remember all these people, so we need to have an internal governance system, and that's where religion comes in. And the more likely people are to stick to the religious doctrines in the area, the more successful the society is likely to be. Because, once again, facilitation of that in-group mentality, which I thought was neat. That's why the religions that survived and thrived did. Because of Darwinism, because of religious Darwinism, because they were beneficial to the ethos at the time and the location where they were. That's neat. You can't tell me that's not neat. So in the final bit of the book, it talks about the differences between liberals and conservatives. And it talks about the mud they sling, firstly, obviously. Like what they think of each other, which is of no value whatsoever. And then our man Haidt admits that he's got all of this moving through a liberal lens. Because once again, he's despicable. He's one of those liberal elites, school teachers, professors, scientists studying a soft and irrelevant science like psychology for the purpose of understanding morality, which is good luck, dude. Yeah? Morality is even less substantial than psychology. I remember when I first went to college, one of the first classes I had was Intro to Ethics. And the first assignment that I did, one of the first essays, was explaining that morals were relative, depending on the epoch that you live in, depending on where you're from. And it's a cultural relativism, basically. I didn't know the word for it at the time because up until that point, I was just a autodidactic hood rat. But I knew the concept. And I tried to explain the concept in the essay, assuming that I would be graded on merit and not factoring in that the 65-year-old liberal white woman with the turquoise necklace and the single large gray braid that hung down to the middle of her back, who teaches ethics, was not going to be interested in my amoral waffling. That was one of the first bad grades I got in college. This is when I learned I could get bad grades. After trying, I said, what? No, I put in effort. But I put in effort having the wrong opinion. And that was ethics and intro to biology, interestingly enough, which is strange because these are major interests of mine. But those were the lowest grades I got in college, a C and a D, respectively. Our man Haidt is able to force into these... He's able to explain the difference between liberals and conservatives by how they both think that God's on their side. They both think that they're speaking from a position of moral righteousness. The problem is the standards by which they define moral righteousness are different. Because liberals largely define theirs because Democrats largely define their understanding. Holy fuck, can we please? Because Democrats largely define their understanding of what is moral across the domains of being kind and being accepting. Right? And that was just 2 of 5 touchstones for the conservative understanding of ethics. And that's not to say that those aren't factors that are in consideration for liberals. It's just they're nowhere near as important as kindness and acceptance. The greatest priority of the liberal moral compass is to ensure that if someone is being unfairly persecuted, oppressed, that must stop. The oppression must stop at all costs. Whereas there are all these other factors that conservatives are more concerned with than oppression. Like, largely, by and large, conservatives are going to say, yeah, we have to stop oppression. But what we actually have to stop is spending all this tax money on these free riders, and these concepts of fair. That's it's unfair to them. So fair or free market. Maybe not free market, depending on your branch of conservatism, but at least vague understanding of an unregulated market. That's going to be more important to a conservative because that is also sort of a work ethic thing that conservatives largely don't believe liberals have. And liberals don't value as highly, by and large. All other things held constant. So I don't need any liberals in my comments at all. But like, I also don't need any liberals in my comments showing up to be like, well, I'll have you know, despite my crippling liberal brain disease, I work 80 hours a week and donate all of the proceeds to the poor, which is another thing that they said, that people who are religious are more likely to donate their money, or at least to be seen donating their money. But when they controlled those factors, it turns out religiosity was not a predictor of who was more generous with what went to charity. Just the report thereof, which is doubly ironic, because by my understanding of Christianity, you're not supposed to do it for the acclaim. You're not supposed to do it for the clout, like in the Righteous Gemstones. You're just supposed to do it because, and it's your clean little secret with God. The book ended unresolved because he didn't actually know anything. Because you can't know anything, because there are so many obfuscating factors in the fact that you're studying psychology, and then morality within psychology, and then trying to apply it on a sociological scale, and then trying to shoot it through a lens of evolutionary biology. It's just so much conflation, so much fuzzy logic. There's no way to get to any concrete point, which is unfortunate because the book itself was great. I had a great time with it. I think if you walk away with nothing else, first of all, the Hume quote, which, if the apex of your book is someone else's quote, that's a bad sign. But in his defense, also the 90% chimp, 10% bee thing, that's phenomenal. That's a perfect explanation thereof. I am going to use that pretty much every time I talk about evolution from this point forward. And I talk about evolution 2 or 3 times a week. So it's going to happen. It's going to happen a lot. I am probably not going to use the elephant and the rider analogy because I think that kind of fell flat. But I can't think of a better one. So, I know, dude. It's because you keep eating grass. So, that about wraps it up for this off-road episode of Buck's Books. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Are you incensed? Do you disagree? Good. It's about time you got mad about something. It's about time you stood up for something. So stand up in the comments. Let's have us a dialogue. And regardless as to where you stand, like, follow, subscribe, click, I don't know, do all the stuff you do. And I'll talk to you soon.